Hey everyone, James Proctor here with Real Mob Stories, and today we're going to talk about the New York's five families. I was asked to rank from weakest to strongest all of the five families. So I took on that goal, and so I'm here to actually give you my results of who I think's the strongest, going from weakest to strongest, and also I have an honorable mention I want to talk about. So please do me a favor and hit the like button, and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't, as we have more of this type of content coming out all the time. And without further delay, on to our feature presentations. So we'll start out before we rank the New York five families from weakest to strongest. I'm going to give you an honorable mention because this family isn't actually based in New York. This family's based out of Elizabeth, New Jersey, but they have crews in New York. And I'm talking about the DeCavalcante family. They have a deep and rich history going back decades. And this family has crews actually in both the borough of Manhattan and the borough of Brooklyn. And so it wasn't until the 1940s, going into the 50s, that you had a cohesive New Jersey family, which reemerged as the DeCavalcante family later on. And in 1964, Sam the plumber became the boss, and that was kind of the what I would say is the peak of the DeCavalcante family. I would say with Sam the plumber going into John Riggy, and at that time, the family was actually well respected, was pretty powerful. All of these jokes about them being a glorified farm team. If you go back and look at what they were able to accomplish, then you wouldn't call them a glorified crew. And so these guys, like I said, were centered in the Elizabeth area of New Jersey. They had crews in Essex, Union, and Hudson counties. Um, they never had more than about 50 or 60 mate guys at their peak. Right now, it's smaller from what we can tell, probably around 30, 40 guys at the present time. And the DeCavalcantes actually had some influence on the Jersey Shore. They had some of the Central Jersey towns. So in fact, by 2010, they had Charles Stango out in Las Vegas that was doing work out there. And in the past, even presently, the DeCavalcantes have guys down in Florida, and they also had some operations in Connecticut, specifically kind of in the Waterbury area. And when Sam DeCavalcante was a boss, he had a close alliance with New York, specifically with Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. So the Cavalcante family always had an influence on the commission, even though they didn't have an official seat on the commission. Most of their rackets, traditional illegal gambling and loan sharking, they've been involved, especially during Riggy's time. They had a lot of labor racketeering. So between the 80s into the early 2000s, labor racketeering was big because they had business agents in the laborers union, and so they had a lot of influence in construction contracts. Also, they were involved in extortions and protection rackets, and through infiltration of unions. Also, they were involved in financial frauds, but there always was respected. They weren't just this glorified crew that a lot of people say, but like I said, they're not out of New York. But I had to include them as an honorable mention because of them having crews out of New York, out in New York. And so when we talk about the weakest of the five, I have to go with the Colombo family. And the Colombos, the youngest of the New York five families, they got their start in 1928 under Joseph Profaci. He was a Brooklyn olive oil importer. And when Lucky Luciano set up the reorganization of organized crime in America, he allowed Profaci to have his own crime family. And their original base was in South Brooklyn. That was Profaci's home territory. So between the 30s and in the late 50s, you had Joe Profaci run the family, and they were pretty stable. but Provaci had a reputation of being greedy, and that's what triggered the first Gallo war against the Colombo family. Eventually, Joe Colombo came into power in 1963, and he was there until the early 70s, and he ended up getting, shot. And then pretty much after Colombo, it was mostly the Carmine Persico that ran the family. And so I said the Colombo family's power base had been mostly South Brooklyn. They had Bath Beach, Bensonhurst, Red Hook, Bay Ridge. They had some parts of Queens and Ozone Park and Long Island City. They also did a little bit there on Long Island on Nassau County. And so by the 1980s, they had several captains and the membership had reached about 120 people. And, the internal wars has just decreased them considerably through the years. We're told that today there's probably 70 to 75 guys that are still within the family, but historically they've kept around 100 made men. The Colombo family had some ties with the Patriarca family. In fact, the the boss, Nicky Bianco, uh, was originally part of the Colombo family as an associate, and he was made in part to help with negotiations between the Gallo gang and the Colombos, as this guy Bianco was part of the Gallo gang. But again, the Colombos had those strong ties in the past with the Patriarca family. I mean, when you think of the Colombo family, though, you have to look at the disorganization that they've had through the years. You've had the three wars that have taken place, the two Gallo wars back in the '60s, and then the big war in 1991 to 1993 that pitted the boss Carmine Persico against the acting boss Vic Arena. Dozens of people killed, arrested, and so I mean the family's just had disarray pretty much all of its time since Colombo was shot. So the Colombo family's the weakest. So who's number four? This is a toss up. I was thinking about between the Lucchese family and the Bonanos, and I think if it depends on what period of history you're looking at. I think if you look at today, it would probably be the Bonanno family. But if you look at it from a historical standpoint, going back to the 100 years, I would say that the Casey family would be next in line of being the weakest. But the Casey family, I mean, they started out, they were mostly Bronx and East Harlem. They can trace back to Tommy Reyna's gang in the 1910s. They actually controlled ice distribution rackets in East Harlem and the Bronx, and they were close to Joe Masseria. So you had the Casa Marce War that broke out, and then Tommy Gagliano ended up aligning with Lucky Luciano, and because of his loyalty, once Luciano put together the organization of Cosa Nostra in the United States, talking about the commission and all that, he gave the family to Tommy Gagliano. And so even during that time, Gagliano's underboss was Tommy Lucchese, and they kept a real low profile. They were pretty much in the 30s and 40s. They were quiet. They operated out of like the 106th Street, 107th Street in Harlem, and but they started building up strength in the numbers rackets. They were involved in the garment district, and they were actually making quite a bit of money. And it was in the 1950s when the family expanded into Queens and Brooklyn. Tony Dux Corrado had a crew in Queens, for example, and probably by the 50s, I'd say the late 50s, early 60s, they were pretty powerful, and they were always aligned with Tommy. I'm sorry, with Carlo Gambino, And what helped the Lucchese family was the marriage of Tommy Gambino, which is Carlo's son, and then the daughter of Tommy Lucchese. And that really helped out the Lucchese family, and they always had the Gambino family looking after their back. Everything went well until Tony Duck's Corallo went to prison, and at that point, they make Vicamuso the boss, which was a disaster because it was really Anthony Gaspipe Casso that was running the family. And this time, it didn't last too long, lasted about 6 years with those guys in power before they got taken off the street. But it was just a period of time of extreme violence. I mean, it was so bad that Amuso and Gaspipe wanted to eliminate the whole Jersey faction of the family. And so Lucchese family, like I said, their traditional stronghold had always been in the Bronx and East Harlem. They started extending up into Upper Manhattan, and then eventually they started having crews in Brooklyn, in Canarsie, and they also had a Brownsville, East New York crew in Brooklyn. And they said that today the Lucchese's family territory spans three New York City boroughs. They're supposedly in the Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn. And we know they also have some ties back into Long Island as well. And the New Jersey faction is still operating as well. But I have to say that with Vicamuso and Gaspipe's reckless behavior, in the 90s, that really alienated the Lucchese family. It really created a lot of problems for that family. And I think they've recovered for the most part because you still have, several capos and folks that are around that have strong leadership skills. But at the same time, they were definitely hurting numbers where, they're about half the size that they used to be. So next, I have to go with the Bonanno family, and they're out of originally Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And then if you want to trace them back to Sicily, they're from Castellammare del Raffo, and they got their start in the late 20s. Immigrants from Castellammare went to Brooklyn. They were led initially by Salvatore Manzano and were close to him. And after the Castellammare War in 1931, when Lucky Luciano set up the commission, you had Joe Bonanno set up as boss of what would be his Bonanno family. And I would say for the first 30 years where he ran the family, going into the 60s, I mean, they were a model family. You didn't really hear much about the Bonanno family. I mean, they were very traditional at that point. I mean, obviously, Bonanno changed as he went into the 60s, and a lot of his changing was that he didn't like the new guard of bosses that was coming up. For example, Carlo Gambino. He didn't like Carlo Gambino, and quite a few of the bosses started changing back in the 50s. Everything had been stable the first 20, 25 years of the commission, but then starting in the 50s, you started seeing moves from underlings. You saw older guys dying. So things were changing with Cosa Nostra, and Joe Bonanno didn't like it. The Bonanno family really suffered through the Banana War that was in the mid 60s. In fact, Bonanno ended up getting exiled out of New York, and he was replaced by Rusty Rastelli as boss. But Rusty Rastelli, most of his time in power was in prison, and so that allowed people like Carmine Galante to take over the family. And he was ruthless, wasn't really liked by the commission, and so you had these factions that were developing within the family because of the poor leadership. But when you look at the Bonanos, their past, they were always tied to a lot of the other families. They had very strong ties to Montreal. They partnered with the Cotroni and then later the Rizzuto clans. Also, they were through through blood was actually tied to the Buffalo crime family. But, things really started going bad for them in the 1970s and early 80s with the Donnie Brasco infiltration. I mean, it became such an embarrassment, and a lot of the people got put in jail because of it. And in addition, they lost their seat on the commission because of it. And then we know about Joe Messina, what he did once, he started off looked like he was going to really bring the family back to where it once was, but he ended up flipping. And yeah, the family went through several acting bosses and wannabes until finally Michael Mancuso. So the second most powerful family in New York is the Gambino crime family. And you can trace their lineage to the early 1900s through guys like Lupo the Wolf, Giuseppe Morello, and Toto D'Aquila. And the first boss, well, you had Frank Scalise as boss for a time before he actually spent most of his time as an underboss, but it was Vincent Mangano, really was the first boss of the Mangano family, which would become later the Gambino family. And their power base was the Brooklyn waterfront. Uh, the Mangano family controlled the International Longshoremen's Association, so all the dock work there in Brooklyn that went through the Gambino family, and everything ran really smooth for them up until 1951. That's when Albert Anastasia made his move, and Vincent Mangano and his brother disappeared. They were killed, is what happened. And then in 1957, eventually, Anastasia is killed and Carlo Gambino takes over, and which I'd say would be kind of the golden age of the Gambino family. And in fact, Gambino was so powerful that he was considered like an unofficial boss of bosses. And even since then, you had Paul Castellano. He ran the family for about 10 years, and then you had the shift from Brooklyn to Queens when John Gotti became boss. And so through John and through the different ruling panels and eventually Peter Gotti as boss, the family stayed with the stayed with the Queens faction until in charge until like 2011. And then since then, it's went back to Brooklyn and the Sicilian factions. But the Gambino family has always had a large, expansive family. They operate in all five boroughs of New York and beyond. They have Manhattan's West Side and Midtown. They have Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, Bay Ridge, Dyker Heights. They've got Queens, Staten Island, Long Island, in both Nassau and Suffolk County. They also have crews in New Jersey, and even have got crews down in South Jersey. And so the Gambinos have always had a huge influence in both Jersey and New York. And there's estimates, and this might be high, I don't know, but they're saying in the 1960s that the Gambino family might have had upwards of 500 made men. I don't know if that's true or not. I would say it'd probably be closer to 250 to 300 men. I mean, we're told that today there's probably around 180 guys that are made in the family. But, they've always been, it's always been throughout the history of New York's underworld. You had the Gambinos and the Genovese vying for that number one spot. Both of them have done great jobs, but I would say that the Gambinos would be the runner ups. And they've also had specific crews like the Cherry Hill Gambinos. These were Sicilian Zips that were based in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. You had the Howard Beach crews, Staten Island. You had crews in South Florida, particularly around Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Also, Los Angeles. They've influenced a lot in Los Angeles, and you can't forget that they also had crews in Baltimore, and that continued until probably the 1970s. And so they pretty much had influence everywhere. Even Philadelphia, they had some influence with the Philly crime family, as Carlo Gambino was close to Angelo Bruno. But if we're going to look at now in 2025, let's say that Brooklyn, Staten Island would be the two areas that the Gambinos have the most of their influence in. So when we look at the rackets, the Gambinos have been involved in. If there's an illegal revenue stream available, the Gambinos have been involved in it. They a lot of labor and construction racketeering. We already talked about the New York waterfront. There was a concrete club. There's a Teamsters Union, Local 282. They were involved in. They had their garbage hauling rackets, bookmaking rings, high stakes card games, extortion of businesses. Also, a lot of white collar crimes, securities fraud, pump and dump schemes, gasoline bootlegging. They even got involved with. They've dabbled in dope trafficking as well through the Pizza Connection. And pretty much all the unions, or a lot of the unions, the Gambino family had some sort of influence where they were able to milk money from them. And if it wasn't for our next and most powerful mob family today, I would put them as number one. But we have the Genovese family, who is our strongest mafia family in New York and probably the United States. So the Genovese family is often nicknamed the Ivy League of the underworld because of its pedigree and sophistication, and they can descend themselves all the way back into the 1890s with the Morello Terranova gang of East Harlem, and they had a big presence on 116th Street in East Harlem, and so that is where they really emerged and became powerful. Later on, you had some of the other Manhattan crews with the Greenwich crew, but for the most part, it was Manhattan that really gave the Genovese the power that they had because that's where the money was. It was in Manhattan. And so they also had a lot in the Bronx at the time. And then later they expanded into all the five families, like the Gambino family. When Frank Costello was boss, they had a lot of political connections. He was the prime minister. And also, I think what's really helped the Genovese family is they've the one family that's learned to try to mislead law enforcement. They've done a pretty good job of that through using front bosses. And so law enforcement has historically had trouble even knowing who their boss was. I mean, you had front bosses like Fat Tony Salerno. In fact, he was uh, part of the commission trial because they thought that he was the boss, and he wasn't. It was actually Chin Gigante that was the boss at the time. But the thing about the Genovese family and why they're the top family, and I think will always be the top family, is they know how to keep a low profile. They also have a level of sophistication with their rackets. They have more money coming in than any of the other of the five families, and they've always had good leaders. And most of their leadership is came from that 116th Street crew. If we look outside the New York City area, the Genovese family have crews in New Jersey, both in North and South Jersey. They have crews, a big crew at one time in Springfield, Massachusetts. Also, they had crews in Connecticut, particularly in New Haven, Connecticut, where they did a lot of garbage carting and construction rackets. And Genovese family for decades had crews up in upstate New York. They operate mostly in Albany, Utica, Saratoga. They're said that they control gambling at the Saratoga racetrack. Also, a lot of the smaller families were represented on the commission by the Genovese family. For example, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. They're all known to align or be represented by the Genovese family on the commission. Membership historically, at least 300 plus members. I know Joe Valachi said they had 450 members in the early 60s, but I think that was probably an overestimation. I'd say it was probably closer to 300, but Today, there's probably close to 220 made guys. That's according to law enforcement. Um, they have about 10 to 15 crews, and many of the crews, like the 116th Street crew, they're still around today, and they've been around for over 100 years. And the Genovese have dominated construction, waste management, and trucking industries across their territories. They've been involved in the waterfront. So you remember the Genovese family had the Gambino family had the Brooklyn docks. Well, the New Jersey docks and that waterfront was always been the Genovese family. And they've also took advantage of Manhattan's real estate. They've done a lot of stock fraud, a lot of the white collar um, crimes the Genovese have taken part in, and also the New Jersey's Newark port. That's been another Genovese profit zone. But they've always influenced the commission. They were either in charge of the commission or they were in charge with the Gambino family. And I don't see that ending anytime soon. I mean, they had a lot of influence on like Philadelphia, Philly's bosses. They helped to get Angelo Bruno to take over. They also helped Sam DeCavalcante with the Jersey family make their family grow. So, I mean, I think the family's just going to continue to stay relevant. Oh yeah, the Fulton Fish Market. Has another one that they had. Also, they help control Times Square, and so, although they're not as strong as they once were because of how law enforcement has got the upper hand on all the mob, they're still going to be strong. And I don't see any other family being able to surpass them as the strongest family in New York. So that's all I wanted to go over with you today. In review, my order from weakest to strongest of the mob families is the number 5 being the Colombo family, number 4, the Lucchese family, number 3, the Bonanno family, number 2, the Gambino family, and number 1, the Genovese family. Let me know what you think. Do you agree with my picks? Do you think that I have one family too high or too low? I'd love to hear what you think. And besides that, until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.